And start. Hello, everyone. I am Amanat Bashram, and I am the temporary programming person for the African American Cultural Center, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Thank you all for joining me and the African American Cultural Center as we continue the Faculty Fellowship Q&A series. The Faculty Fellowship Program at NC State is a program that supports NC State's faculty members' research endeavors into African American and African diasporic cultures. This semester-long fellowship was conceived and coordinated by the AACC's former director, Dr. Sechelle M. Ford, who established the FFP to support scholarly projects by NC State faculty that share the AACC's mission. For today's talk, we are joined by Dr. Jason Coupet. Dr. Coupet is an associate professor of public administration in the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University. He studies efficiency and performance in public and nonprofit organization, including HBCUs. His research has appeared in Nonprofit and Voluntary Sectors Quarterly, Public Performance and Management Review, and Business Strategy and Environment Administration and Society, as well as Nonprofit Management. His work has been funded by the Salon Foundation, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, and the North Carolina Department of Transportation. For this project, Dr. Coupet engages data envelopment analysis, a non-parametric quantitative methodology based in linear mathematical programming that scientifically benchmarks HBCUs. Open to dispute the idea that historical Black colleges and universities are homogeneous, Dr. Coupet presents relevant data that enforces the idea that the existing heterogeneity among HBCUs could serve as a source of strength. Moderating this event is current Vice President of AYA and current President of SAC, Joni Tan. Joni will be reading submitted questions for this event. And should attendees have questions during this Q&A, you're more than welcome to send them to me privately via chat or the Q&A feature in the webinar. Now, without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Jason Coupet and Joni Tan.
Hello, I am Joni Tan. I am a junior. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I will be asking the questions for this event. Welcome, Dr. Coupet, and could you please introduce yourself?
Hey, y'all. Jason's fine. Jason Coupet, Department of Public Administration over in the School of Public and International Affairs. Like was mentioned earlier, I study mostly efficiency and productivity in public and nonprofit, sort of community-facing organizations, but also strategy, right? And sort of helping them, helping us learn how to use data, manage data, and analyze data to best inform the decisions that are sort of community-facing and social service organizations have to make, helping them optimize services, serve as many people as they can, et cetera. So it's really about making sure that the organizations that serve the least of us are doing the best that they can with what they have. So thanks for that. That's mostly it. I'm a native Chicagoan. I've been here at NC State. I think this is year number 6 that we're in now. So 2 kids. One of them might pop their little heads in. So sort of forgive them in advance. But that's mostly it.
Thank you. So for our first question, can you give us a specific example of practical ways you see HBCUs utilizing their differences to help build each other up?
Yeah, so I should clarify, I didn't attend an HBCU and have never worked at one. So a lot of what I know has just been around sort of in the research space, and then the sort of tangential support role that I've played in some non-HBCUs, but predominantly Black or minority serving institutions. And I think that there's my experience with it, as limited as it is practically, is such that it seems informal, right? I mean, you'll notice that deans or presidents will talk to each other. There is, I know, a meeting that happens annually where HBCU presidents and some other high-level executives typically will meet, often in Hampton, Virginia, to sort of walk through, um, um, to share with each other and sort of, but it seems more fellowship than it is anything sort of formal. As far as hoping to learn, a lot of HBCU leaders were trained at similar places. So again, sort of Hampton, a lot of folks have connections there. So the networks, I imagine, are tight in ways that are difficult to see formally. So there's probably some informal networks happening. But my own approach to this is both practically, but then also for the policy discussion, right? I think that we tend to treat HBCUs, we sort of paint them with a broad brush as like HBCUs this, predominantly white institutions that, and it's always seemed weird to think of it like that, in the sense that no one, what is a predominantly white institution is a sort of really broad way to think about, right? NC State, for instance, is very, very different than Peace College, right? So the sort of that broad brush doesn't make any sense. Two totally different missions, different student bodies, different profiles. And I think to some degree, there's meaningful variance in how we think about HBCUs too, right? And they do different things. They serve, they're in different places with different, partially shared history, but they're in different states with different political systems and with different leaders. And I'm hoping that to the degree to which the leadership at HBCUs are learning from each other, hoping to extend that, but then also engage the policy discussion in a way too, where we're uplifting the successes within that variance as well.
You mentioned painting HBCUs with a broad brush paint stroke. In your opinion, where do you think the idea that all HBCUs are homogeneous came from?
I think so. For one, there is a shared history broadly, right? I mean, HBCUs as a set of universities broadly sort of popping up, during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, as and some of them had different academic missions, obviously, but as normal schools or social uplift institutions for newly freed African Americans. And I think what's happened is that the researchers have taken that view, and in some sort of a meaningful sense, I think that there's a collective vision across HBCUs where there's a sort of we're stronger together, right? And so to the degree that which we can bond together and communicate the both shared successes and shared issues broadly, our voice can be more powerful. So I don't want to take away and say that that's all bad. I just think that there are things that HBCUs can learn from each other in some ways where they do things differently. So I think that it comes from a shared history, and at least in my conversations with folks, look, the things, we're stronger together, right? If all of us serve students that are poorer on average than others. And so collectively speaking that voice on behalf of the students we serve and in our collective missions can be important. But I think from the research end and from the policy end, there isn't as much done to sort of systematically build out and learn from the differences, if that makes any sense.
So how can this research, if this is something that you would want your research to be used for, how can this research be used for Black students' retention and success at PWIs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so for a couple of ways. So while I think it's important for other HBCUs to look at their peers to say, what are they doing that works? It also can be important for schools that are I guess, non-HBCUs, because that can include, lots of different spaces, including schools that are predominantly indigenous or Latino or Latinx or whatever, right? I think that and schools that are predominantly white, I think a lot of what HBCUs do, other schools can learn from too, right? I was just reading a paper last week by a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago that essentially found that there are 3 HBCUs that do such a good job in returns to education, in the sense that their students earn such a much higher wage than other HBCUs. And these are similar students, right? So the same student goes to 2 different HBCUs. There are 3 of them where their wages are just way higher than expectations. And it's to the degree to which that if you look at the averages and include those 3, it looks like students that go to elite schools actually don't earn a higher wage premium than ones that go to non-elite schools. And it's the effect is driven by 3 HBCUs that are just incredibly successful at getting their students placed and getting a wage there. And so other HBCUs can learn from that, but also non-HBCUs that have diverse student bodies, right? What are these schools doing that allows their students or supports their students in such successful ways? I think is important. So the broader these general learning from each other conversations can have between organizations, right? I think the better, right? Like I encourage my graduate students, I guess our graduates, to do that all the time. Like talk to the people around you. You know what I'm saying? Like learn from each other. You might do real good. You know, in the quant sequence, another student might have a really good reading technique. And even though all of y'all are part of the same PhD program and have the similar experiences across the faculty, some of y'all do stuff better than others, right? And so talk to each other and learn from each other in a way. You might pick something up that you don't do, that you don't have now, and vice versa. And I feel like organizations should do the same thing, particularly HBCUs, right? We should be encouraging that from a policy perspective, funding it and making it a way that we support learning across HBCUs, within HBCUs, and between HBCUs and PWIs is part of the way that we support the HBCU institutions in general. So sorry for that really long answer, but I just had coffee.
No, thank you. That was good. That was great. Were there other tools of measurement you used in your data collection, such as employment after graduation, income, or like qualitative resources that you mentioned in your presentation? What were the other ones?
Yeah, so that particular presentation was pretty limited. It really was just to sort of show off the technique. In past attempts at this, I have used mixed methods where I've sort of talked to administrators about challenges and successes, stuff that can hinder productivity. There's a lot of that actually in the literature that one can gather from. A lot of sort of interview-based data, talking to HBCU administrators and students about what the sort of collective and shared challenges and successes are. There are other quantitative techniques too that I've used. So data development analysis is sort of a one way to look at organizational success. There are others as well that sort of come from different backgrounds and paradigms. I've used those too. This is really just like, hey, it's almost like a show and tell, right? Like, hey, here's a way we can compare HBCUs that is scientific in the sense that we come into it with a set of assumptions and we can hold ourselves accountable to those assumptions based on the research design. So this is just one tool. There are others, and I've used those too. It really is about when you're benchmarking for learning across organizations. I was just explaining this to my students last night. I'm like, you really want the full package. And so you might use a tool like this to go, hey, wow, I didn't expect that school to be performing so well. Let me get on the phone with them and figure out or let's sort of dig deeper. And a lot of the issue that, well, I'm rambling again. You may ask this later, but a lot of the issue, and this is not just HBCUs, but it certainly is HBCUs, but any sort of extremely resource constrained organization faces is that so much of your resources are tied up in getting through the day-to-day and for your mission that these sort of like, I need to commit 5 to 6 staff hours for 6 months to learn from it can be impossible, right? I mean, we don't have the resources for that. And so one of the big arguments that I'm hoping to make is that, look, we should be, the White House initiative for historically Black colleges and universities sort of designates a set of funding set aside for any institution that qualifies for an HBCU. It can range from a few $100,000 to a few $1,000,000 that comes from so it's sort of unrestricted or less restricted federal money. And the kind of conversation I'm hoping to spur is that, how about we fund some capacity for these kinds of things, right? Where we may pull together some consultants or some policymakers in this space and have a rigorous scientific protocol that's designed to sort of pull out best practices and then fund them being implemented in other spaces. But yeah, so that's going to be everything. That's not just the science stuff, but talking to each other, formal interviews, informal interviews, case studies, et cetera, policy reports. So yeah, no, the whole gamut. This is just one small piece of what that would take.
So how is benchmarking different from a comparative analysis, and why did you find using benchmark science particularly useful for this specific research?
Great question. So I see benchmarking as a subset of a comparative analysis, right? It sort of is it's a set of tools that we use not just to compare, but to learn from those comparisons, right? There are lots of ways that we can sort of compare one another, and particularly in this sort of space of neoliberalism, right? Often those comparisons are made punitively, right? To sort of say who gets the stick. I don't know. I'm a big fan of The Wire. I think I've watched that whole series like 100 times. And like you can, the scenes in there, right, where the police commissioners are using the data, the comparisons across the districts, really to shame the districts that aren't doing as well, could be one way to compare. Benchmarking is not that, right? And that's sort of what attracts me to it. When it's done well, right, the idea behind it is, are two things. So we're trying to compare in ways that facilitate learning across spaces. The second part is that we need to do that in a way that is rigorous, right? Where we are holding ourselves accountable to some set of principles, even if only loosely, based on the scientific method, so that we know that our comparisons are grounded objective is not the right word, but grounded in a way that we are trying to pull out who are our peers and who should we look to learn from in this space. There's a danger, I think, the reason that the benchmarking science is important is that there's a danger, in my opinion, in comparing not just HBCUs, but organizations in general without that perspective. We often in our brains think we know who's doing something the best. But so we'll say we need to learn from, University X or from program Y, or their name brand is whatever. We always think of that, right? Like I have an uncle that's an audio engineer. He's like, everyone thinks Bose are like the best headphones because everybody knows Bose, right? Like, but the reality is, right, if you're looking for good help, they're like way better options for less money. But it's just, we think of that, right, as like, that's the standard. And organizations can fall into the same part. Without name dropping, I'm sure we could sort of rattle off the list of what the best HBCUs are, right? Benchmarking science doesn't rely on our sort of institutional reputational knowledge to sort of say who we should be learning from. Often when we call the data, we'll go, where's that school, right? And you'll see like they're kicking everybody's butt. It's like but you don't know. Right, if it's some school in rural Texas, right, that has 1,000 students that, aren't on like the map, right, we can risk not learning from those. And so I think that's why. That's the science part of it. So embracing learning, but the science part comes in where we really are trying to do the best job we can at learning, identifying peers and learning from who we should be learning from, and not just what we think off the top of our heads.
Thank you for that answer. Have you already seen some HBCUs use benchmarking and DEA at their universities? How did it look, and what are some, no?
Well, so I've engaged some HBCUs in this, and it's really difficult to pull off, I think, for a couple of reasons. And this isn't just an HBCU thing. This is anytime I work with nonprofits, to some degree public agencies as well. When you're doing quantitative comparisons, there's a little bit of a risk, right? In the sense that what happens if I don't look good, right? Like, and it becomes like getting on the scale, right? When you like, ooh, I ate too much last week. Do I really want to hop on there this morning? Because you don't want to see what's on there, right? And you don't know who else is looking, and the risk for that can be real. Because if it gets out for some way, like I'm low performing, that can compromise my ability to get funding later, increase political pressure. So I think that that's one. But the more pressing angle is capacity, right? I mean, it's just I talked to one HBCU institutional analyst at a school in Alabama, and he was like, they go to the it's called AIR, the Association for Institutional Research, where all these sort of data geeks at colleges that are processing institutional data, they have this annual conference every year, and he's like, I'm embarrassed because a lot of these wealthier schools, they'll show up with an army of 15 people, right, that are responsible for like crunching numbers, putting together and analyzing survey data. And he's like, I'm in a school of 10,000 and it's me, right? I mean, so I don't have the capacity. I don't know what that is, but even if I wanted to learn it, I don't have the capacity to do so. Even if I did, what would I do with that? Everyone's stretched so thin, and I don't really know who would I give this to? How could I explain it? So there's a capacity issue too. And I think on the second part is really what I want to hit as a barrier, because there are ways to beef up this capacity, right? We should be funding. There's a big movement in nonprofit science that is saying, look, federal grant, and the feds do a good job of this. Well, they do a job of this anyway, when other spaces may not. But if you're going to give a grant for X amount of money, you also need to fund the capacity to evaluate that grant, right? So if I'm funding capacity for evaluation, I think is sort of, in my opinion, a frontier for HBCUs, where we really should have robust comparative, but then also sort of collective scientific analysis to really figure out what's working and what isn't, right? If we're looking for improvements.
Thank you. In your presentation, you talked about data and development analysis. Can you give a brief overview of what this programming does, and what would you say are some disadvantages to using this program?
Great question. So it essentially, data and development analysis combines a set of weighted ratios in a non-parametric way. So it's not statistical. There's no error term here. But it is mathematical. So essentially, it weights ratios in a way of your inputs. So, right, the things that you use to fulfill your mission, and then your outputs or outcomes, the things you produce or do, right? Those are input to output ratios, and it weights them across a broad set of whatever it is you use and whatever it is you do, right? So HBCUs use lots of things to do lots of things, right? Most of them around students, but to some degree, research and et cetera. The advantage to DEA is that it weights those in a way that makes you look the best. So it weights your best ratios highest, and then compares you to other organizations that have a similar mission, similar inputs and outputs, and tells you how you stack up using those ratios to what your peers are. So it helps you identify peers in a way that's scientific, and then it tells you how far away you are from this peer. The downside is that it's comparative, right? We never really know. It's hard to know what's possible if you're only comparing yourself to what is, right? I don't know if that makes sense, right? If you go, look, I'm the fastest runner on my track team, right? I'm from Chicago. I ran track in high school. I was not one of the fastest runners, but we had a really quick dude who was like, man, fastest guy on this track team, fastest guy in the conference. You move that guy to Mississippi, I don't even know if he makes the track team, right? And so we have the same thing where a downside to any of these sort of frontier-based technologies is if comparing yourself to, even if you identify like a best performer or a peer that you really want to look to emulate, we don't know, right? That peer is relative, right? This is the one that stands out relative to everybody else. you don't know what's possible. It's hard to know what's possible based on what you have already. And there's some other downsides statistically to it that if you're using it to model other things, that can be a challenge, but that's the big one.
Thank you. Last question. What are some advantages of using DEA to measure HBCUs, nonprofits, and other organizations? Just overall.
Yeah, big advantage, in my opinion, is it is the peer. So two big ones. The first one is the selection of peers, right? So DEA doesn't compare you to everybody. What it does is it takes the ratios that you have that look really similar to other folks and compares you to those. And so when you're pulling out and you're going, well, why did you compare me, to that person? They're not like me at all. That's an apples to oranges comparison. With DEA, you can say, well, this is why you're a peer of this person, right? This ratio looks a lot like this, this other ratio, this ratio at another school. And so that's a big one, right? It gets us away from like who we think we're alike, right? If you ask an NC State student, like, what school do you think NC State is like? You ask 10 of them, they are going to give you 10 different responses. Half of them are like, we're not like Carolina at all. I hate them, da, da, da. Then the other half's like, no, we're the other flagship. We're just like, but all of this is just us thinking, right? DEA does that quantitatively, right? Ways that you can trace. And I think that's a big upside.
Thank you, Dr. Coupet, and I will now pass it to Amanat for final remarks.
Thank you so much for that. And actually, before I give my final remarks, I actually have a few questions of my own because some of your answers brought up a few things for me. So kind of going back to how you answered the question where you haven't seen a lot of HBCUs use this analysis because they're scared of what's going to happen, or they're scared of the answers they're going to arrive at based on their reputation. They kind of brought up the idea, where it's like, a lot of the HBCUs, a lot of the colleges that we think are good colleges, the numbers might actually say something different. So you kind of have this reputation versus numbers game. And what do you think are what do you think could potentially be the social and economic impact of this when it comes to higher institutions?
Yeah, great question. So I should clarify that it's not just HBCUs. Like I don't think I've ever I work a lot with public and nonprofit sector organizations. I try to stay pretty engaged. And I can't remember one time I presented some DEA results and people were like, can you destroy that after we leave? Right? Like there's this, that's always an issue, right? But the big thing I think is, to me, is if these comparisons can be done in a way that can help drive better policy, I think is really what the upside is. Like what I would like to see, and again, this may be happening to some degree, and it just isn't written about, and I'm not in those circles because they're informal. But what I would like to see is sort of more of this at the federal level, where this kind of analysis is being funded, and then institutionalizing the learning of best practices. So there was, and if you run the numbers from the 2010 to 2020s, there's an HBCU, I think I can say their name, in Texas. I think it's Payne College. I'm not 100% sure. I can get that. But at least they're not in the sort of, at least in the lore of like the elite HB. But when you put those numbers up, they spend less per student than a lot of the more prestigious named places, and had tremendous growth in student outcomes over that 10 years. And what I would like to see happen, and there have been some reputational effects, but that should be institutionalized, right? In my opinion, that we should be regularly meeting and funding these meetings and these learnings where we're going, can you tell us what you did? And can we fund implementation of what you're doing and measurement of how it works on our campus, right? I think will be a big upside to formalizing use of technologies like DEA, not just DEA, but like DEA, right, where we can have a technology that we're saying, look, we don't think it's perfect, but we understand what the benefits and the drawbacks are, and we're going to use this as a part of a bigger tool package to learn from each other. So to me, I think that that's really where the standout is potential.
And my next question, it kind of like presents the idea of maybe using DEA at a much smaller scale. So how useful do you think using DEA could be when it comes to aiding campus departments, like for example, OIED? Like how useful do you think using a data envelopment analysis would be to kind of help us, to kind of help OIED figure out how to, do work around inclusion and diversity on the college campus?
Yeah, no doubt. The good thing about DA, it's agnostic to what those comparisons are, right? So if you have good quantitative data, and by good I mean valid and reliable, right? Quantitative data, and you're making comparisons across the same technology, so the sense that we know these things are being used to do this, and that's the same across those comparisons, you can put anything in there and learn from it, right? And so I think, if there's student outcomes or administrative outcomes that OIED, offices like OIED may find useful, for instance, the impact of their trainings or student experiences of the students they support, satisfaction with the services they offer. And if you can get the same data across comparisons, then you can make really, really useful a really useful attempt to learn, right? I think that's the big thing with DEA is not like, all right, well, here's this number. We all need to be imitating exactly what they're doing. It's to tell you who to pick up the phone and call, right? If you, in my opinion, like if you look at that and you go like, they're kicking our butt. Like, why are they, let me find out what they're doing, right? That's working so well. And I would really like to see that be a part of how most organizations do things, but particularly the ones that serve the least among us, right? We really need to make sure that what we're using to serve is working, right? And learning from each other is a good way to do that.
Yeah, well, those are all the questions that I had for you. Thank you so much for doing this. It was very, very informative. It's a very important subject. It's important to kind of touch on how do we measure successes and what's an actual quantitative way of bringing those ideas and bringing those projects to life. So do you have any announcements, anything you'd like to plug that you have coming up?
Oh no, thanks for the opportunity. But no, I'm just trying to keep the wheels on my life at this point. I think that's sort of the optimal thing. We do have a call for papers out in the Journal of Public Administration Research. In theory, that folks who think about and study issues like race and class and the way organizations deal with them and perpetuate them. We are looking for papers, and so you can contact me if you have that kind of if you have scholarship in that space at my email jacoupet@ncsu.edu. So I'll be looking forward to reading what people have in that space. And if you're interested in public sector issues, nonprofit issues, you may want to work in a nonprofit. Please consider applying to our Masters of Public Administration program. We have a great faculty that are committed to students who are engaged in public service. So if you're looking to like, hey, what am I going to do after graduation? I'm scared of this job market. I really like public service. How do I use my skills to serve those around me? Our MPA is a great option. So please reach out to me at the same email, jacoupet@ncsu.edu if getting an MPA is interests you.
All right, all good things. I would just like to thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Dr. Coupet, for your time. And I'm just gonna bid you all adieu, I guess. Stay safe, take care of each other, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
All right, thank you guys, appreciate it.